This is the third time an airline has bet its future on Fort Lauderdale. The first two lost. JetBlue is number 3, and right now it's pouring more daily flights into this one airport than it has ever run anywhere else, even as it shrinks across the rest of the country. Back in 2004, a struggling US Airways went first, with a wave of Caribbean and Latin American routes and a promise that Fort Lauderdale was the future. 3 years later, that plan was gone. Then Spirit Airlines picked up the leftovers and ran the whole thing again, right up until Spirit shut down for good in May of 2026. JetBlue calls Fort Lauderdale the third leg of the stool, the future of the whole airline. 2 airlines already bet that same future here, and both are gone, which leaves the one question this story turns on. What is it about Fort Lauderdale that keeps swallowing the airlines that try to own it? Let's start with what JetBlue is doing, because the word people keep using is takeover, and takeover is a big word. It deserves some proof. Here's the proof. Before Spirit collapsed, JetBlue was running about 68 flights a day out of Fort Lauderdale. That was already a serious operation. But the morning Spirit switched off its planes, JetBlue moved within hours, and it moved hard. Within 24 hours, it announced 11 new destinations from Fort Lauderdale. Some were places JetBlue had never flown before, like Cali and Barranquilla down in Colombia. Others gave familiar American cities, from Nashville to Indianapolis, their first direct link to Fort Lauderdale. On top of that, it offered $99 rescue fares to Spirit passengers who were suddenly holding worthless tickets. It offered jobs to Spirit's pilots and flight attendants and ground crews, the people who had just watched their airline die. And then it started adding flights. Fast. By that summer, JetBlue was up around 130 departures a day, and it has told everyone who will listen that the number is heading past 150 by the peak of winter. That is more than doubling an entire operation in under a year. Now here's the part that makes this more than a headline, and it comes down to market share. Before the collapse, JetBlue controlled roughly a quarter of Fort Lauderdale, about 24% of the seats flying in and out. After the collapse, that jumped to around 36%. And for the first time in the airport's entire history, JetBlue became the #1 airline at Fort Lauderdale. Not a challenger, not a strong second, but the single biggest carrier at the gate. So when someone asks how JetBlue is taking over, that is the answer, in plain numbers. It grabbed the empty gates, the stranded passengers, and the routes, and it moved from 4th or 5th in line to 1st in a matter of months. That much is real. And it is hard not to be impressed. The question is whether it lasts. And to understand why anyone would pour this much money into one airport, you have to understand why this particular airport is worth fighting over in the first place. Fort Lauderdale is not a huge airport by the numbers that usually get quoted. It is the 19th busiest in the United States. It moved about 32 million passengers in 2025. Its bigger neighbor, Miami, sits 21 miles to the south and handles nearly double that. On paper, Fort Lauderdale looks like the smaller sibling that never quite catches up. But paper misses the thing that makes this airport special, and it is sitting less than 2 miles away. Port Everglades. It is the 3rd busiest cruise port on the entire planet. Close to 5 million cruise passengers move through it every year, and most of them fly in first. Think about what that means for an airline. A cruise passenger is not a business traveler who might switch to a video call next quarter. A cruise passenger is a family that booked a holiday a year in advance, and they are coming whether the economy is up or down. They fly in, they sleep in a hotel by the port, and the next morning they board a ship. Rain or shine, boom or bust, that river of people keeps flowing through the same airport. That is guaranteed, repeat, high-value traffic, and it does not care about a recession. This is the engine underneath the whole story. Fort Lauderdale is what the industry calls a leisure gateway, which is just a fancy way of saying it is an airport built to feed vacations rather than business trips. For a budget airline like Spirit, that was perfect. Cruise passengers wanted cheap seats to Florida, and Spirit packed them into single-aisle jets by the thousand. But here's the twist that JetBlue is betting the company on. JetBlue can carry those exact same passengers and sell them more, a bigger seat, a premium cabin called Mint, a little extra legroom for a little more money. Same route, same holiday, same family, but a higher price on the ticket. JetBlue's average customer already spends more than Spirit's ever did. So the plan is not to fly different people. It is to fly the same people and earn more from each one. On a spreadsheet, that is a beautiful idea. And if you have watched this channel before, you already know that beautiful ideas on aviation spreadsheets have a way of meeting a very stubborn reality. And this one starts more than 20 years ago at the very same airport. Rewind to 2004. Fort Lauderdale is a smaller, scrappier place, and a big legacy airline decides it is the future. That airline is US Airways, and at the time, US Airways is not in great shape. It is financially shaky, fighting to stay relevant against bigger rivals, and it is looking for a corner of the map where it can plant a flag and grow. It picks Fort Lauderdale. In August of 2004, it announces that Fort Lauderdale will become a focus city. Now, a focus city is a step below a full hub. A hub is an airport an airline builds its whole network around, funneling passengers through it like a wheel with spokes. A focus city is smaller and more targeted, a place where an airline concentrates flights to a specific set of markets without turning it into the center of everything. And if you enjoy these hidden aviation histories, the ones the news cycle skips right past, take a second to subscribe now, because this one has a twist almost nobody sees coming. The market US Airways wanted was the Caribbean and Latin America. The plan was ambitious. It launched with 8 international destinations, places like Cancun, Kingston, and San Juan. And within a few months, it had applied for 5 more, reaching further into the islands and down into South America. Add it up, and you are looking at around 13 international routes aimed straight at the islands and the coasts to the south. At its peak, in early 2005, the Fort Lauderdale operation touched 28 destinations, counting the mainland connections that fed it. It looked like the start of something real. Does any of this sound familiar yet? A financially pressured airline, a wave of Caribbean and Latin American routes. Fort Lauderdale declared the future. If you swapped the logo on the tail, you could run that exact paragraph today and call it JetBlue. There is a line an old aviation hand left in the comments of another video about this airport, and it stuck with me. Everything old is new again. That is the whole story in 4 words. Because US Airways stood exactly where JetBlue is standing now, made almost exactly the same promise, and pointed at the same patch of Florida sky. And it did not work. To understand why JetBlue should be nervous, you need to understand precisely how the first version of this bet fell apart. Because the thing that killed it had nothing to do with luck. It is still sitting there, 21 miles down the road. That something is American Airlines and its fortress at Miami. A fortress hub is the industry's term for an airport that one airline controls so completely that rivals can barely get a foothold. American owns Miami like that. It has for decades. Miami is the beating heart of Americans' entire Latin American empire, with more routes, more frequencies, and more connections to the region than anyone else can match. And that is the wall US Airways drove into. Every Caribbean and Latin route it tried to build out of Fort Lauderdale was competing 21 miles away against an airline that did it bigger, cheaper, and more often. There was no room to win. Fort Lauderdale started losing money almost from the day it opened, and a route that loses to Miami on price, on frequency, and on connections all at once does not turn a corner. It just drains cash, month after month, until someone with a spreadsheet decides enough is enough. That someone arrived in 2005 when US Airways merged with America West and a new management team took over. They looked at the Fort Lauderdale experiment and, to put it kindly, were not in love with it. The unwinding came gradually, one cut at a time, the way most of these retreats end. A couple of the Central American routes were gone by the spring of 2005. Guatemala City service got shifted north to the airline's real hub in Charlotte by the end of that year. The exciting plans for new destinations were simply scrapped in early 2006, and by January of 2007, there was almost nothing left. The whole focus city, the Grand Caribbean gateway that was supposed to be the future, had been dismantled in under 3 years. US Airways walked away from Fort Lauderdale and it never looked back. But an airport like this does not stay empty for long. And here is where the story stops being a coincidence and starts being something stranger. Because the airline that moved in to fill the gap US Airways left behind was Spirit. And the person running Spirit's charge into Fort Lauderdale was a man named Ben Baldanza. Now hold on to that name because of where he came from. Before Spirit, Ben Baldanza spent years as a senior executive at US Airways, in charge of marketing and international operations. He was there in the early 2000s. He was there when US Airways dreamed up the Fort Lauderdale focus city in the first place. And then he left, joined Spirit, and rebuilt almost the exact same operation, serving almost the exact same cities at the exact same airport. Let that sink in for a moment. The same man who helped design the bet that failed under US Airways went across town and made the identical bet again under a different logo. All of this is on the record, and it is the kind of detail that makes you wonder whether these decisions are really about strategy at all, or whether some airports just have a gravitational pull that keeps dragging the same people back to make the same move. If you have ever wondered why airlines seem to repeat each other's mistakes, drop a comment, because this is about as clean an example as the industry has ever produced. Ben Baldanza passed away in 2024, but the operation he built at Fort Lauderdale outlived his time at Spirit by more than a decade. And that second bet, the Spirit bet, is the one that actually worked for a while. Spirit did not just dabble at Fort Lauderdale, it moved its headquarters down to South Florida into a building in Dania Beach right by the airport and made Fort Lauderdale its flagship. It grew the operation into something enormous. By the middle of the 2020s, Spirit was flying roughly 11 million passengers a year through Fort Lauderdale. It ran more than 60 routes. It controlled close to a third of the entire airport, and for years it was the undisputed #1 carrier there. Where US Airways lasted 2.5 years, Spirit lasted more than 20. It looked permanent. It looked like Spirit and Fort Lauderdale were simply going to be married forever, which is exactly what makes what happened next so jarring. Because on May 2nd, 2026, after a long slide through bankruptcy and a fuel price shock it could not absorb, Spirit switched off its entire operation. Overnight, the biggest airline at Fort Lauderdale was gone. 17,000 jobs vanished. 60 routes stopped. And the flagship hub that had defined the airport for a generation went dark. It was the first shutdown of a major United States airline in a quarter of a century. The disappearance was so total that Broward County officials actually discussed buying Spirit's empty headquarters building because the company that had defined the local economy for a generation simply was not there anymore. And it left the single largest empty airport hub in America sitting there, waiting for someone bold enough or reckless enough to take it. Which brings us back to JetBlue, and the fair question of whether this time really is different. Because JetBlue's leadership is not naive. They know the history, and their argument is that they are not making the old bet at all. US Airways and Spirit were trying to run Fort Lauderdale as a low-cost, high-volume machine, flying cheap seats against Miami's giant. JetBlue says it is doing something new. It is converting Fort Lauderdale from a discount hub into a premium leisure gateway. Instead of racing to the bottom on price, it is adding the Mint premium cabin, exploring a dedicated airport lounge, and chasing the higher spending traveler that Spirit never bothered with. And to be fair to JetBlue, some of this premium flying at Fort Lauderdale is not brand new. It has run its top-tier Mint service on the long transcontinental routes out of Fort Lauderdale to Los Angeles and San Francisco for years now. What is new is the scale, and a fresh daily Mint route to San Diego arriving this winter. The whole plan is being funded by a brutal round of cuts everywhere else. Under a turnaround strategy it calls Jet Forward, JetBlue has exited 15 cities and killed around 50 routes across its network. It walked away from markets it had served for years. It dropped its long-haul flying to Amsterdam. It pulled back from Newark, right in the heart of the busiest airport region in the country. Dozens of smaller routes simply vanished from the map, one after another. And the money saved from all that shrinking is being funneled into this one airport. JetBlue's own president called Fort Lauderdale the third leg of the stool, standing alongside its two anchors, New York and Boston. That is a company telling you out loud that it is placing one of its biggest bets on the airport that has already buried two airlines before it. There is a real logic to it too. Think about who actually flies into Fort Lauderdale. Someone who has already spent $3,000 or $4,000 on a cruise is not going to flinch at paying a little extra for a wider seat and a proper meal on the flight down. The vacation is the expensive part. The plane ticket is a rounding error next to the cabin they booked on the ship. Spirit treated that passenger as a bargain hunter to be squeezed on fees. JetBlue is treating the same passenger as someone with money to spend who simply never had a better option before. If that read is right, JetBlue can charge more and still fill every seat because the customer was never that price sensitive to begin with. That is the whole thesis. That is the BET, and it is smarter than the one Spirit made. The trouble is that a smarter bet on the same stubborn airport is still a bet on that same airport. And JetBlue is not the only one circling the wreckage. When Spirit died, it did not just leave gates for JetBlue. It left a giant hole that every budget carrier in the country wanted a piece of. Frontier Airlines went after it hardest, roughly doubling its Fort Lauderdale flying in a matter of months. Smaller carriers like Breeze and Allegiant moved in to fight over whatever cheap seat traffic was left behind. Meanwhile, the old guard shifted around too. Southwest, which used to be one of the biggest names at Fort Lauderdale, has actually been retreating for years, shrinking its presence and pushing its international flying over to Orlando instead. American added a little capacity, but American is not really interested in Fort Lauderdale because American already owns the airport people take seriously in South Florida, and that airport is Miami. Delta and United sit steady in the middle, neither charging in nor backing away. So what you are left with is an airport being carved into layers, JetBlue on top as the dominant leisure gateway, a cluster of budget airlines scrapping underneath for the low-fare crowd, and for the first time in decades, no single ultra-low-cost carrier running the show. That last part matters more than it sounds, and it leads straight into the part of the story the celebration always skips. So what could go wrong? Start with the thing the cheerful version never mentions, which is you, the passenger. For years, Fort Lauderdale had an ultra-low-cost carrier at its core, an airline that stripped everything down to the bone and charged rock-bottom fares, which is what Spirit was. Love it or hate it, that airline set a price floor. It kept everyone else honest. Now it is gone, and there is no single ultra-low-cost carrier running Fort Lauderdale anymore. The airport is being rebuilt around premium seats and higher revenue per passenger, and higher revenue per passenger is a polite way of saying higher fares. Someone left a comment on this exact topic that cut right through the celebration. Higher fares are nothing to celebrate. And they are right. A win for JetBlue's shareholders and a win for the family flying to a cruise are not always the same win. If you have flown out of Fort Lauderdale on a budget airline and you are watching your options slowly get more expensive, I would love to hear whether the nicer experience feels worth it to you or whether you would trade the legroom back for the old price in a heartbeat. JetBlue does have some clever answers to that worry. It sells a ticket that folds in a ride on the Brightline train, so in theory you can fly into Fort Lauderdale and connect onward toward Orlando on a single booking, which is something no other airline is really doing. It is a smart idea. It is also worth being honest about, because the Brightline station is not sitting inside the terminal, so it is not quite the seamless walk off the plane and onto the train that it sounds like. And that points to a bigger set of cracks in the airport itself, the ones no amount of marketing can paint over. Fort Lauderdale has only 2 runways, and it is one of the most delay-prone major airports in the country. Getting in and out of it by road has been a headache for decades, with no direct train into the terminal and parking that locals will happily complain about for an hour if you let them. There is genuine upside too. The nearby Palm Beach Airport is drawing down some of its operations, which leaves more room for Fort Lauderdale to grow. But an airport with 2 runways and a traffic problem has a ceiling, and JetBlue is betting it can fill that airport to the brim before it hits that ceiling. And finally, there is JetBlue itself. This is not a financially comfortable company making a bet from a position of strength. JetBlue has been losing serious money. It suspended its profit forecast after that same fuel spike that helped kill Spirit. It is carrying real debt. Its own founder publicly warned about the risk of bankruptcy, a warning the current leadership pushed back on hard, but a warning the market heard all the same. So the airline making the biggest single airport bet in its history is doing it while fighting for its own financial life. If that sentence makes you a little uneasy, you have been paying attention, because it is very nearly word for word the description of US Airways in 2004. Fly into Fort Lauderdale today, and the change is impossible to miss. Where you used to see a wall of bright yellow Spirit tails, now it is JetBlue in nearly every direction. Even the lounges and the crews are JetBlue now. The airport did not just swap its biggest airline, it changed its whole personality almost overnight. So where does that leave us? Fort Lauderdale has not been taken over so much as it has been reset, again. A shaky airline with a big dream is pouring everything into an airport that has swallowed exactly that kind of dream twice before. US Airways lasted 2.5 years. Spirit lasted 20. JetBlue is telling us this is the future, and maybe it is. The cruise passengers are still coming. Port Everglades has not slowed down. The demand that made this airport valuable in the first place is absolutely real, and JetBlue has moved faster and harder to claim it than anyone expected. There is a version of this where JetBlue does what neither of the others could, holds the airport, converts it, and turns Fort Lauderdale into the crown jewel it keeps promising. But there is another version, the one this airport has run twice already, where a stretched airline plants its flag, calls it the future, and quietly walks away when the numbers stop working. Right now, honestly, it is both at once. So I will leave you with the same question we started with, because after 20 years and 3 airlines, it has earned an answer. Is JetBlue the one that finally makes Fort Lauderdale hold? Or are we watching the third airline in a row drive into the same wall, certain that this time is different? Tell me which way you would bet in the comments, and if this is the kind of aviation story you want more of, the ones hiding in plain sight, send it to the one person you know who would argue about it. I will see you at the next gate.